No, I got a letter back. I got a letter back saying, no, we haven't made a mistake. It's definitely you, and please will you bring 5 other people? And we have no funds. So I realized this was an important challenge. And I rose to it, and I took 5 people. But I had no idea how I was to make that kind of a presentation in that kind of environment. And I didn't know, and I didn't know, and I didn't know. And the 5 people that I brought, I thought were just part of the audience, until when we were driving up into the Himalayas, or Himalaya, I started to get an inkling. And the night before we were to do this, sitting on a rooftop, have any of you been to Dharamsala? It's a pretty special environment. And at that time, Hotel Tibet had a flat roof on the top, and I was sitting on the top, and one of the things that you will know if ever you go there is that they have big crows, and they shriek into the night, and it was completely classic. It was a full moon, and the crows were going, and I was sitting under the stars thinking, what am I going to do when the whole thing crystallized in me? And that was, disease is a manifestation of health. And when those words came, I realized that everything I'd been struggling with in the hospital, in my training, in my junior post, suddenly made sense. If disease, we have symptoms because we're healthy. We have symptoms because there's something that needs addressed. We have symptoms because we're waking up to certain things. And I had had those various experiences. And I started to play with it in my mind. What does that mean for Alzheimer's disease and cancer and, congenital abnormalities and genetic diseases? I mean, off one went. But it was suddenly really clear because I experienced it. It was a cellular experience. And then I also knew that what I had to do was get the other 5, get them up and tell them they were speaking the next day. And one was my wife, who at the time was a midwife and working with home deliveries. My mother, who teaches sacred dance and art. We had a Jungian analyst who I'd worked with, who had been a Carmelite nun. And I had a color mental therapist who was a zero balancer and acupuncturist, who was one of 7 children, 7 boys, 5 of whom had manic depressive disease, 2 of whom committed suicide, and 2 of whom had AIDS. And he had found his way through this whole pathway, through his own healing journey, to bringing these skills together. And I was completely inspired. I was just completely awake. And I knew exactly how we had to do this thing. And I pulled this whole thing together, and we spoke. And it was amazing. I don't remember anything about the rest of the conference at all. Most people don't, really. Something really magical happened, and that meant that we then got this incredible time to speak with the monks. And I learned all kinds of really interesting things about how they work. Now, disease as a manifestation of health was born there. And I didn't do anything with it. Too scary. And then I started to write about it, and I published the paper in 1999. Now, in 1999, that was a very controversial thing to be saying. Now, actually, when you look at what's happened in molecular biology, molecular genetics, epigenetics, in the neurosciences, and as we begin to understand much more about how the brain works, this is a formula, or if you like, a mantra that begins to have real traction. And I think it's something that we want to explore in ever greater depth. And I think it has very serious and very profound implications. So I agree with this particular quote that we are actually entering into a completely new age in terms of our understanding. And again, I'm going to say it, and I'll say it 1,000 million times. This is not foofy-doofs. This is a scientific reality. When you follow where we are in physics, when you follow where we are in molecular biology, this continuum, which at the moment hangs on our concept of energy, which is quite interesting in itself, because nobody can give you here it is, and yet it's everything. Now, that's, I think, a very beautiful way for us to go into exploring what health and disease is all about. I love this in particular because what I want to do now is to very deliberately touch the emotional reality of our lives. If disease is health, then for me what was really important about that was it made sense of everything. But I needed to understand the language. Now it's quite interesting because we have a language that has emerged over generations that relates. We talk about the heart, don't we? We talk about the gut. We talk about spirit. We talk about the spirit being in the bottle when people have a problem with alcohol. We talk about the way things are gut-wrenching. And this language and its relationship to the body is ancient. But we pay it lip service. Lip service. How do we go past the lips into and incarnate? And what I have found in my personal trajectory is that the more I pay attention to that, the more I start to receive information that is really useful. Now, and the reason I have this slide of Johnny Depp's is that it actually, as a physician and a physician scientist, the most challenging thing to say in any public arena is that it's all love. Because we're out of the 60s. And that's really foofy-doo. But what is interesting is without exception, every human being is seeking it. And in some way has their own unique perception of manifestation of that reality. And as one tries to explore it, as I've tried to explore it, I've found that there are certain fundamentals, and I'm going to come back to it throughout the rest of what I have to say before we open everything up. It's very challenging, and I want to use the word specifically, and I do not mean anything that is sentimental. The sentimental leads to friction, it leads to opposition, but it leads to that because it isn't the real thing, and the objective of all life is the experience of the real thing. And when we experience the real thing, physiology shifts at a fundamental level. And we can measure it if we've got to keep going back into that paradigm. And we need to, because it's part of us. We've got to address every level. If every level isn't satiated in some way, it won't all come together. And some of us experience life in a much more emotional feeling sense, some more intellectually, some more physically. So we'll each have, but it's actually there needs to be balance in the whole. Now, I then use this gentleman's quote. And I use it because I've been incredibly privileged to have had intimate time with Tony Robbins, one-on-one with Tony and with his wife. I've been really privileged to have looked after her and to have met what's at the core of this extraordinary giant of a human being. And I love this quote because I think this quote speaks for everybody who's on their journey, whatever it might be, and I'll read it out if there's anyone having troubles. You're in the midst of a war. Love is not foofy-doof. Love is war as much as it is gentleness. A battle between the limits of a crowd seeking the surrender of your dreams and the power of your true vision to create and contribute. It is a fight between those who will tell you what you cannot do and that part of you that knows and has always known that we are more than our environment, and that a dream backed by an unrelenting will to attain it is truly a reality with an imminent arrival. I love that quote because of the energy that's in that quote. The refusal to bend in a certain way, to buckle in the face of other people's expectations when inside you know you have a mission, you have a purpose. And that mission and purpose is incredibly important because disease is health. in that it is leading one to the realization of what that is. And that isness is unique to each person. And it's one of the fundamentals. It's what the fundamental human rights that we're talking about, the new human rights, is based upon. That uniqueness is not, will not, and cannot submit to the paradigms of others. Why is religion falling apart? It doesn't serve any longer. We've gone past it. It's done its job. We're moving into something that is so unbelievably amazing, in that we have the continuity of the scientific right through to the esoteric and the most subtle. So if we then flip, let's just flip to the left side of the brain again and look at the practical reality of the world at the moment from a health perspective. Never before in our documented history has there been such a burden of chronic disease in the world. And yet we are at the most technologically sophisticated, biomolecularly sophisticated that we have ever been, to our knowledge. But it's not helping people. We're drugging them endlessly. Look at this. There are 260 million Americans. 133 million of them, over 50% of them, have at least one chronic disease. That's completely awesome. 45 million, okay, that's a fifth, have at least three simultaneously. Look at it. In 1960, 1.8% of children were believed to have a chronic disease. In 40 years, that's over tripled. 75% of their annual expenditure is spent on chronic disease. Well, there's an amazing figure, which is that 70% is spent on the last 10 days of life.
But at the same time, we have to agree that also the US population has outgrown, so respectively you have a higher population. Naturally, this figure will grow.
No. This is mind-boggling. 50%, so let's just take it, 50% of this room with chronic disease.
I know, but nowadays we're living also
older. So we have the assumption that because we're going to live older, we're going to have chronic disease.
No,
Thank you very much.
We're living nowadays with much more clinical conditions.
Well, okay, now that starts to get really interesting. Because if you come from the paradigm that disease is health, then 50% of the Americans having a chronic disease is a seriously healthy thing. Because it's saying this ain't right. Something's wrong. Now, when we wake up to that as the language, instead of condemning everybody and blaming everybody for being fat and alcoholic and drug addicted and whatever else, actually, it really needs a responsible, the eighth right that we talk about, it needs a responsible culture that says, hold on a minute. Where does this come from? What is this really about? Why is it I have to find the spirit in the bottle instead of the spirit through? Now, the really interesting thing is that it is through that, and it is through that suffering. It is through the coming to the point where I cannot and will not do this anymore, that I can open up to something that is a completely different reality. It doesn't happen any other way.